I would also argue that it sows distrust in your example and mine. When you delay those conversations and you do have to have them eventually and you start to disclose these hard facts or these hard conversations, if somebody knows that, why didn't you tell me this 6 months ago? In my wife's case, why didn't you tell me this back in the earlier in the year? That can sow a lot of distrust, which just compounds on the other issues that you just outlined. And when you start to lose trust with your spouse, your kids, your employees, or your peers, that's where relationships really, really start to fall apart. Welcome to Under Pressure, the podcast about becoming better men when it counts. I'm Cody.wav.
And I'm Brian Alfaro. Each week, we have honest conversations about building businesses, leading families, carrying responsibility, and the pressure that comes with trying to do all of it well. If that sounds like your world, you're in the right place.
No hype, no pretending we've got it all figured out, just real stories, real struggles, and what we're learning along the way. Let's get into it.
Before we get started, if today's topic resonates with you, you'll probably enjoy The Forge. It's our free weekly newsletter where we share lessons, stories, and practical ideas around business, family, responsibility, and becoming better men. You can join at forgingbettermen.com. Now let's get into it. Cheers.
Cheers. Let me ask you something. Is there a difficult conversation that you need to have but haven't had yet, that you've been rehearsing over and over and over? You've been practicing in your head. You know you need to have it, but for some reason you've been putting it off, whether it's your wife, maybe a business partner, a colleague, peer, a friend. Has there been that conversation that you know you need to have, but you've just been putting it off for any reason?
The answer to that for most of us is yes. And the crazy thing is we're avoiding it because we think we're being patient. We're waiting for the right time. We're waiting for the right moment to have that conversation. We think there's a perfect environment to have that conversation but the reality is we're actually just scared of having that conversation in general.
The conversation itself isn't the hard part. It's what happens afterwards. That's the difficult part. It's what if we offend someone? What if we ruin the relationship? What if we upset someone? It's the aftermath of those conversations that's the hard part for us to deal with.
And the problem is, Cody, is I've learned this from experience, is every conversation you avoid starts charging you a little bit more interest, compound interest of that. And before you know it, after weeks or months of avoiding that conversation, you end up in a situation where it's a much bigger conversation than it could have been in the first place. And that's what ends up getting you in trouble.
So today we're talking about difficult conversations, what it costs us when we don't have them, why it's so important, and then how those conversations are often the most important conversations that we need to have.
I've learned the hard way that the conversation you're avoiding is usually the one you need to have the most. So let's talk about that. Let's share some examples here. What's maybe one story or one example you can give us of a conversation you've avoided recently? And we could talk about some of the consequences you had avoiding that conversation.
I can think of one that was most recent, and it's kind of timely because you and I just talked about this several weeks ago on the show about having difficult conversations about money with our spouse. And so earlier this year, I had a pretty significant tax liability due to some of the real estate investments we've made over the last couple of years that didn't go so well. And my wife and I have been both very fortunate. We've invested our funds into a real estate portfolio that was very beneficial from a tax perspective for us for many years. And this year was the first year that we had such a significant tax liability. I knew it was coming from being actively involved in the management of the portfolio and understanding the real estate. My wife, not so much, being more passive. And I knew this year was going to be a pretty consequential year. And I had dropped subtle hints to her throughout the year, like, hey,
Man. Can't leave those breadcrumbs. They don't work.
Yeah, I was like leaving breadcrumbs here and there, and just kind of like just subtly preparing. But it really wasn't until we had the estimate from our CPA with what our potential tax liability was going to be, where I was like, okay, we need to sit down and have this conversation. And so my fear in doing that, the reason why I didn't just come out of the gate, at the beginning of the year and say, hey, here's what I think is going to happen, is similar to what I shared several weeks ago. Is I was afraid that she may revert back to some of those same emotions and feelings we had many years ago, where certain investments didn't go well, certain opportunities didn't go well. And that led her down this path of just feeling a lot of almost distrust because of the way that, the management of our money wasn't being fruitful. And so I was trying to very subtly introduce that conversation again, because we had been through so many different financial losses and negative impacts. And my fear was that this was going to come back and she was going to revert back to those same feelings she had before. And it was nerve wracking for me to kind of sit down and be like, "Hey, babe, sorry, we gotta write a pretty big check in this year." Um, and I think for her, in having the conversation, she actually took it quite well, which luckily it was a relief. However, the one thing I think was most frustrating for her is just not understanding why the tax law works the way it does. Why do we have a tax liability when you have investments that don't go well and you have a capital loss? And my wife, again, not being somebody that's active, it's very confusing for somebody that's not in it every day like you and I are. So trying to massage that message and not confuse her even more and try to explain that was, a bit of a task, but we made it through it. And, she's in a good spot, and she's just like, well, it is what it is. It's, you can only control what you can control. Right. So, but I definitely kicked that one down the road for a couple months, probably longer than I should. So what's an example maybe that you have recently that comes top of mind?
I'll talk a little bit about business. When you're in any type of leadership position, having those tough conversations is a non-negotiable. It's something you have to get good at. And when I was younger in my career, in a leadership position, I used to get nervous or scared, I guess is the best way. You're 18 years old and you're managing people that are older than you, often more experienced than you, telling them they're not doing a good job at something, giving them constructive criticism, coaching them, trying to earn their respect, but ultimately trying to get the result out of them. That was always hard for me. I can think of examples of people that had been, I was in the restaurant industry for a long time, people that had been in the restaurant industry for 5-10 years ahead of me only being in a couple years, getting into leadership roles, where I would have to go and sit them down and basically let them know, like, hey, these are the things that are not going well. And if we don't see improvement within this time period, like an action plan, right, we're going to have to let you go. So the idea of having that conversation with somebody, or the thought of having a conversation with somebody at that age, at 18, 19, 20 years old, was very scary for me. Very scary for me to have that conversation. And I knew what needed to be said because I had some good mentors in the space and people that had told me this is how you approach the conversation. I just didn't want to say it. Right? You don't ever want to look somebody in the eye when you're that young and you haven't done it before, and have a tough conversation that will make them uncomfortable and then ultimately make you uncomfortable as well. So I wasn't avoiding the conversation. I was more avoiding the outcome of the feelings that you would feel when it comes out of your mouth, like, "Hey, you're not doing a good job," or that first time you have to sit down and fire somebody, right? It's like you're not necessarily scared of the words that are being delivered, just like with your wife. You're scared of the outcome that will happen
The
after you
impact.
deliver that message.
It's tough. It's the impact that you have on people that make it so hard, and knowing that somebody else's well-being is in your hands, and in your example as a leader, right? So Brian, with those examples, let's kind of tie it into why do we avoid those situations. Let's kind of dive deeper into the reason why we try to avoid those.
For me, everyone's a little bit different, but for me, I'm a big people pleaser. That's something that I think a lot of people can relate to. We already mentioned a little bit that people have the fear. So fear is kind of a common one that you'll see very often. People are fearful of having the conversations. Again, not necessarily the words, but the outcomes that will having. They're afraid they're going to ruin a relationship, damage a relationship, make things uncomfortable for somebody else. So I definitely had all those fears. But for me too, it was definitely about people pleasing. It was definitely about that fear of rejection as well. Having that conversation, thinking in my head like, oh man, if I sit down and tell this guy he's not doing a good job, what if he rejects me and pushes me back and says, well, I am doing a good job. You're not doing a good job. Maybe it's you, it's not me. Just going through that mental exercise, like you go through 1,000 like what if situations, like what if they reply this? What if they reply that? What do I say if they reply that? And you're preparing for something that usually never ends up coming. You end up finding out that the conversations, I'm not going to say they're easier than you thought they were, but they're not as bad as you thought they were. And all the things, the outcomes you were thinking of end up usually not happening. But what are some things that maybe you think men are afraid of in particular when it comes to like having these tough conversations?
Well, I know in your experience, that's probably true for a lot of men. In my case, what was different for me is the feeling of not wanting to engage in conflict and
Getting uncomfortable. Yeah.
getting uncomfortable, right? Because typically when you engage in conflict, how you react, how you behave in those moments can linger on a lot longer than just that conversation, and how that impacts, in the case of like my wife and this conversation that we were having, that has the potential to impact our family and the environment in our home.
There's that awkward tension
It's
you
that
feel.
awkward tension,
Yeah.
and there's that old saying, right? When happy wife, happy life, right?
Yep.
And
It's a,
it's a real thing.
yep.
And I'm probably similar to you in a leadership position. I've been in several leadership positions in my healthcare career, and when you have conflict, that conflict can resonate across an entire team, and it can really disrupt the environment and the culture that you set for your team. And those are hard conversations to have. They're very difficult situations to deal with. And I'm in a way as well. I like being accepted. Not necessarily. You don't have to like everything about me. You don't have to like my lifestyle or my values per se, but I genuinely pride myself on being somebody that people enjoy being around, whether you like everything about me or not. And I think the feeling of also not being liked, or the feeling of being disliked by someone, is something that I don't like. It's something that is uncomfortable to me. If you don't like me for some reason, it's almost like it's something I do take personal. And so when you have to have those hard conversations, those difficult conversations, especially as a leader, for me, it's, well, man, what is this person now going to think about me or perceive me as following that conversation? Which isn't the best way to lead either. You shouldn't. That's not what should be top of mind.
Do you think avoiding those conversations is an act of kindness, or is it really stemming from a place of fear? I think you can still be kind, but be direct.
Both can be true at the same time. We oftentimes, and I have been guilty of this, we mask our fear of the outcomes of those situations. We mask it with the label as, well, I want to be kind as well. But I think the best leaders, the most mature men, I think, have an ability to be able to deliver those messages and deliver those hard conversations in a way that's still respectful, but also gets to the point and gets to the heart of the underlying issue. And so you can still give somebody dignity in having a difficult conversation. And when you can do that, to me, that would mitigate those fear factors. But it's a challenge. It's very hard to get to that point of maturity. And unfortunately, it takes a lot of practice and repetition. And that means having a lot of those difficult conversations.
Yeah. So taking practice and repetition means that you're going to have to get better at it over time. And what that means is you're probably going to avoid some of those conversations along the way for an act of kindness or, maybe out of fear. But that means that there's a cost of avoiding these conversations, or that there's a cost to trying to be kind and maybe sugarcoating things along the way versus having the direct sit down conversation. What are some things you think that happen if you avoid this conversation totally and you just don't have it?
I think it's unique to the situation you're in. I'll reflect on my experience that I was sharing with you earlier with my wife. And for me, it was that fear of resentment. Again, that cost associated with the resentment and the past experience that we had. And what you have to realize, or what I had to realize, is I could also create a situation where there's resentment that may build for not having the conversation sooner, for not,
And cause more distance.
absolutely causing more distance and friction in the relationship. And that's the double-edged sword when it comes to these difficult conversations. Again, in your head, you convince yourself that, well, if I wait maybe for the perfect time or the perfect words or the perfect scenario, then maybe the conversation will go differently. But in reality, when you continue to put those conversations off and you continue to delay, more often than not, it's a worse outcome than if you'd have just had the conversation up front. And that resentment can rear its ugly head just from you delaying having that conversation.
Absolutely. And I think you see the same thing when it comes to business. In business, that you have similar outcomes where you can have resentment and different things like that. But really it can have a financial impact, because if you're avoiding a tough conversation and that is having a financial impact on your bottom line, that's not a good thing. Likely means you have the wrong employee in the building. If you can't have that conversation with somebody and let them know they're not doing a good job and that you need to see improvement over a period of time, or whatever the conversation may be. Maybe it's just, maybe they're not a bad employee who needs to be fired or anything. Maybe it's just a professional disagreement about strategy or direction or something like that. But that can have a financial impact on your company, can have a even bigger impact on your culture as well, which is arguably just as important as the bottom line, because the culture impacts your finances so much. But it also can lead to what's even more important, I think, is missed expectations for that person. Because you and I know we have a similar leadership style, and we always want to lead from the front, and we set the example for people, and we believe people have the best intentions. But if you're not having those tough conversations with employees, you're misaligning expectations, you're not clarifying those expectations. And when you don't clarify expectations, what happens? People tend to miss them,
Things
right?
go off the rails.
Things go off the rails. And at the end of the day, if you're the one avoiding the tough conversation and that person ends up not working out, I would argue that it's not them, it's actually you to some degree. You have to take some, maybe not 100%, but you have to take some ownership of the fact that that person was dragged along over maybe an extended period of time, versus sitting down early, having that hard conversation, setting the expectations, making sure that you were calibrated, making sure that you were aligned, and maybe they end up recalibrating and working out great and everything's awesome. But because you avoided that conversation, they went even farther off the rails. They started impacting your business in negative ways. Now there's almost no turning around. And at the end of the day, you have to take some ownership in that. You have to take some ownership that you didn't have that tough conversation. And now that a 5-minute conversation ends up being 6 months of pain.
I would also argue that it sows distrust in your example and mine. When you delay those conversations and you do have to have them eventually, and you start to disclose these hard facts or these hard conversations, if somebody knows that, why didn't you tell me this 6 months ago? In my wife's case, why didn't you tell me this back earlier in the year? That can sow a lot of distrust, which just compounds on the other issues that you just outlined. And when you start to lose trust with your spouse, your kids, your employees, or your peers, that's where relationships really, really start to fall apart. And that's where you really start to lose control. And as you mentioned, you have to take full ownership of that, because it starts with you.
Yeah, not having those conversations, there can be a lot of silent frustration. And that can also happen with parenting as well. We've been talking about marriage, been talking about business in my case, but it can also happen in parenting, where if you're not having those tough conversations with your kid, you're not setting the boundary, you're not setting the expectations. The same thing tends to end up happening with children as well.
And this is something that's really, I think you and I have shared these conversations off mic many a times. I think you and I both grew up in a culture of parenting where our parents were, I would say, firm in expectations. There were more boundaries, I feel like, set over the couple generations. Probably the younger generation, what we've seen is this kind of culture shift where parents, it's almost like you want to establish a friendship with your children more so than you actually want to be a parent. And you want that relationship. The most important people in our lives are our kids, right? And we want them to trust us, and we want to be their person in their eyes. And you want to be kind, you want to be loving, you want to create a culture within your household of trust, and you want them to feel like they can come to you when something's on their mind or something's bothering them. But what tends to happen is when we focus more on being the friend than we do the parent, that's where those boundaries really start to get broken down. And that's where those expectations really start to get broken down. And that's where we start to see a lack of respect within the household, which could ultimately lead to our children behaving in a way that maybe we don't necessarily agree with, or maybe they start aligning with people that we preferred them not to associate with, or they just kind of start adopting values that really we didn't want them to adopt. But they got those influences from the world because we didn't set those boundaries for them at home.
And I think avoiding tough conversations essentially causes problems. What we're discussing is that problems essentially grow in silence when you avoid those conversations. And the emotional impact, and I'll use the term outbursts, you may feel or see, especially with teenagers, my daughter's much younger, so I'm not dealing with a teenager yet. I know you've been there, done that. But the emotional outbursts, and this can happen at work. I mean, I've had very heated emotional employees before. Obviously, we've probably had emotional conversations with our wives, friendships, any type of relationship. When those problems grow in silence and they tend to, it's like a balloon that fills with air, right? Eventually it ends up popping. And the amount of emotion that's been building in that balloon tends to make the conversation much harder and the outcome you desire from the original get go almost impossible to achieve. That 5 minute conversation you could have had with your daughter or your son about something you want to give them advice on or coach them on, or the tough conversation with your wife about finances, about parenting, about a trip you want to go on, or a conversation with an employee about something they're not doing well. That 5 minute conversation that you waited 6 months to have, the balloon filled and then it popped. That conversation's much different. And to your point about respect, the first question I always thought of because that's happened to me, I've been on the receiving end of that, is why didn't you tell me this sooner?
So those are all really good points. But the question now is, how do we have those conversations? What should we do to focus on having those conversations when it's most important?
I just mentioned it, but I'm going to say it again because it's so important, is you got to go in early. You can't wait to have these conversations. The second you feel that feeling, now I will say there's a right place and a right time for conversations. There's also the saying that sometimes you need to pick your battles. Sometimes you're feeling things and you're dealing with a bunch of different things and it's not the right place at the right time and it's not a battle you want to fight, at least right now. So it's something to be mindful of, but you do need to go in early. Waiting 6 months, waiting a year, waiting 6 weeks, waiting any amount of time, especially if it's important and urgent, waiting any amount of time that's going to make it even more damaging down the road is typically one of the first reasons things go wrong. The second thing is you may go in with the intent of knowing that you need to deliver some sort of message, but we have to go in curious with no expectations because we don't know how that person is going to respond. We need to seek to understand first versus trying to win a conversation, versus trying to say, well, I need to deliver this message and I got to get my message across. And if I get my message across, I'm winning. I'm winning the conversation. We need to go in there understanding why are they behaving this way? If it's a kid, for example, if it's an employee who's underperforming, why are they underperforming? If it's a spouse who's maybe doing something that doesn't make you happy in the house, why are they doing it or why are they not doing it? If you're in a business relationship or business partnership, why is this person not living up to their end of the business agreement? Going in curious is, I think, a part that people miss because we spend so much time scripting the conversation in our head. We forget to go in and remember that the most important part of any conversation is actually listening. What about some other things, Cody? What are some things that maybe you think are important for people to think about when they're going into these conversations?
I think that number one for me is focusing on behavior and not character. And I think it's important to remember that when we're having these difficult conversations, the person on the opposite side of that conversation is a human being as well. No, neither one of us are perfect. And in those moments, in those difficult conversations where there's an underlying issue at hand, it doesn't mean that somebody's a bad person. It doesn't mean that somebody's a flawed person. It just means that there's an issue that needs to be addressed, and that usually is a behavioral issue. That doesn't mean that there's an attack on somebody's character. And it's very, very important to distinguish the two, because when you start making it personal, when you start making it about somebody's character or their integrity or who they are as a person, you're never going to be able to earn that person's respect or trust back. And ideally, you want to make sure that you retain that and establish that. And I think one of the upsides to having difficult conversations is if it can be done constructively and it could be executed well. I would argue that a lot of times you find that you build stronger relationships through that, because many of us, even though we don't like hearing hard feedback or we don't like having those difficult conversations, if we step back and we really listen, as you just alluded to, if we really actively listen, we appreciate the ability to have that feedback. We appreciate the opportunities when we're given that feedback on the receiving end. And that helps us to establish a trust in that person that's giving us that feedback. So when you're in that position, having to have those conversations, it's really, really important to focus on behavior, not character. There's a really solid business framework that I follow, or leadership framework rather, and it's called the SBI framework. It's situation, behavior, and impact. So you identify the situation and you keep the focus on something objective, something that happened in a moment with a defined event. You focus on the behavior. What were the behaviors that attributed to the outcome that's at hand or that's being discussed? And what was the impact on maybe you as a spouse, you as a father, you as your team lead or business owner, manager, whatever circumstance you put yourself in. But, the focusing on behaviors and impact is so much more valuable than, again, trying to attack somebody's character, which you should never do. The second thing I think is most important when you're having those conversations is making sure that you're not coming from a place of anger.
That's hard sometimes
It's very hard.
with kids.
It's very hard, and particularly at home, it's very hard when you're in the thick of things with your spouse, your wife, your kids, and there's moments where you're pushed, you're tested to the limit, and your patience is definitely tried. And I know I've been in situations where I've had moments that I'm not proud of, where I've overreacted over things that aren't that important. But it's just like you said, sometimes you kind of build it up. It just kind of builds up, builds up, builds up, and all of a sudden, in those moments, there's outbursts and such. And so it's very, very important. Similar to any successful entrepreneur, business owner, corporate employee, whatever, the more that you can be strategic, the more efficient you will be. And I think when we talk about coming from a place of anger, it's very important that you come in with a strategy and you make sure that you're level headed. Nothing constructive ever gets done when you're coming in with a place of anger. You put people in a position of being defensive. You put them in a position where they may get angry, and those two clash, and ultimately you never really get to a resolution or a positive outcome, which is ultimately the goal of these hard conversations. Do you have anything else that you think that is relevant?
Yeah, I think the last thing for me is being direct and just saying the thing that you're trying to get across. I've been guilty of this for sure, where I am nervous about having this conversation with whoever it is. So I kind of dance around it, dance around the bush. You're saying you're adding a bunch of fluff at the beginning,
Trying to be too nice?
trying to be too nice, worried about hurting the other person's feelings, especially when it comes to business and working with employees and things of that nature, where you're trying to tell them, you've been really great lately, but it's like, well, if there's a but, I haven't been that great, right? But you're just trying to not hurt their feelings, like you said. I think people appreciate when somebody is respectful, but also direct. And you can be direct and respectful at the same time. You don't have to tell somebody something really abrasive and aggressive that demeans them as a person, as a human being, back to your character point, that makes them angry. Now they have an emotional anger response. And that ultimately just also makes you look bad, because if you can't deliver that message in a way that's respectful, that probably means you shouldn't be in that leadership position. I think getting to the point and telling people exactly what they need to hear, not dancing around it, is a sign of respect, is a sign of you respecting their character and you having high integrity as well. People don't need all the fluff. Just tell them what they need to hear.
Well, reemphasizing one thing you mentioned earlier about our desire to be kind when we deliver these messages, I think it's important to remember that clarity is kindness, even though that sometimes may seem contradictory. But the more objective and the more definitive you can be in delivering that message, that's actually the most kind way that you can do it, because people will detect when you're beating around the bush or you're adding the fluff. And I think that's where, again, a lot of that kind of defensive mechanisms start to be triggered. People start building that resentment. So coming in with that clarity is a true act of kindness. And just to reemphasize another point you made too, that the goal isn't to win. The goal should never be to win. The goal should be to solve the problem, keeping the focus on the problem at hand so that way we can move past it constructively and together, versus trying to quote unquote win, which may make you feel great in the moment, but if you ruin a relationship or you tarnish a relationship or you impact a culture of your team or your family in a negative way, that's really hard to come back from.
These principles are great. We're talking about how do you actually have this conversation, being direct, not using anger, different things like that. But it's got me thinking, what's one conversation I need to have this week? A conversation maybe I've been avoiding. Maybe you're thinking about, like, man, what's one conversation I need to have this week? And I want to challenge you and then also challenge the people that are listening to think about what is one conversation that they've been avoiding, that if they had that conversation today, tomorrow, in the next 24 hours, that it would take a lot of pressure off of their shoulders. It would relieve a lot of maybe anxiety you're feeling, a lot of stress you're feeling, and also the idea of making this a regular routine. There's a lot of great mentorship and coaching out there that trains people that are in positions that are higher leadership positions, or people that want to be the best version of themselves, waking up early, getting some exercise in, meditating, journaling, setting your gratitude for the day. Like, what am I grateful for today? What are my goals for today? What's my schedule for today? But one of the things that's not very common that I've never heard before is asking yourself every morning, what is one hard conversation I need to have today? I would argue if we all challenge ourselves, including you and me, and start thinking about what's one conversation we need to have, what's one hard conversation we need to have today, our lives would be so much better.
If I'm a guy listening to the show, when I'm hearing this and thinking about this exercise, I would make it a priority, whether on a daily basis, weekly basis. What are those things that make me the most uncomfortable? What are those conversations that I know I need to have, but just for some reason I'm not ready to pull the trigger? Make that your priority. And the key is it only has to be one, starting out with one. You don't have to take on the whole world. I mean, between family life, business, careers, I'm sure there's plenty of hard conversations that you have to have throughout the day, throughout the week.
No shortage.
No shortage of them. And it's not going to stop with just one. But the key is you don't have to tackle the world all at once. It's one bite at the apple at a time. So I think making it priority for just that one, as you mentioned, not five, but one, and really making that the priority, say, we're going to attack this, and we're going to sit down, and we're going to come in with a strategy. We're going to come in with a place of level headedness, and we're going to be direct, and we're going to go have the conversation and get it out of the way. So that way we can begin developing that skill we need to have and developing the comfort that we need to have in managing and having those difficult conversations.
We didn't talk about it a lot earlier, but there's a lot of stress that gets caused by sweeping these feelings and emotions you have, these conversations under the rug. If you know you need to say something to a boss, to an employee, to your wife or your partner, to your kids, and you're going, I'm just not going to say that today. That causes stress, that causes anxiety. So the idea of the exercise of sitting down, challenging yourself, carve out 15, 20 minutes, blank sheet of paper, and write down in each section of your life, in your marriage or your relationship, in your business, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're an employee, with your family. It could be with your parents. It could be with your kids. What areas of your life you probably have at least one conversation in each one of those categories that you need to have. And sitting down and going through that exercises can be stress relieving in its own, to realize, okay, I have a plan. These are the conversations I need to have to get some weight off my shoulder. And then you just prioritize them. You start tackling them one at a time, and you carve out some time to have that conversation with your kids about, their grades, right? Or to have that tough conversation with your wife about the things she's been avoiding doing around the house, or the financial situation that you're in. You were talking about taxes earlier. To sit down with an employee or a boss and to have that tough conversation, you can start to tackle that. And that feeling, that exercise of writing down all your tough conversations and then building a plan to go and tackle them, doing that exercise is a very relieving feeling. It's a feeling that you have a plan, you have a game plan, you have a strategy. You're probably still feeling all the emotions and the nervousness, and you're going to try to avoid not having them and delay and kick the can. But just doing that exercise, setting that sheet of paper on your keyboard in the morning if you work from home, in your car if you drive to work every day, reminding yourself, hey, here's the tough conversations I need to have. Going through that exercise will go a long way in you relieving that stress.
You're going to free up a lot of mental space. You're going to free up a lot of emotional space, and allow you to redirect that energy in things that are more important. When you get past those difficult conversations, when you get past those difficult scenarios, you can then move on and begin focusing on other things that are more positive or have a better impact on your life that you really want to direct your energy to. So Brian, as we conclude here and with our conversation, I think I want to really encourage the listeners, again, the conversations you're avoiding today becomes the problems of tomorrow. So quit avoiding, just attack them, address them head on, and you'll be a better person for it.
If you're listening to the show and you're already going through the list of conversations you need to have, that means it's time to say it. So get out there and just make it happen.
Appreciate you being here with us. Stay connected by joining our weekly newsletter called The Forge, delivered straight to your inbox with thoughts on business, work, family, and becoming a better man. Make sure to check out forgingbettermen.com to sign up. If this show hits home for you, then hit the follow button and leave us a review to help us reach more guys who would benefit from it. This is Under Pressure.